My name is Rebecca Sullivan. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known by the roles I filled rather than the person I was. A wife, a mother, a daughter, the dependable one, the calm one, the one who could be counted on to smooth things over, to absorb tension, to keep the family moving forward without asking too many questions. If you asked people who knew me back then to describe me, they'd probably say I was quiet, reasonable, maybe even a little invisible. Not weak, just steady. The kind of woman who didn't raise her voice, didn't dramatize pain, didn't demand space. I learned early that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone else. And for a long time, I believed that meant I was doing something right. This story isn't about anger. It's not about betrayal in the way people usually expect. No explosive fights, no slammed doors, no single moment that changed everything overnight. There was no villain speech, no dramatic exit. What happened instead was quieter than that, slower, more deliberate. I didn't leave my family in anger. I left in clarity. And that distinction matters more than people realize. What you're about to hear is not a revenge story. It's not a warning meant to scare anyone into behaving better. It's a record of what happens when someone who has been underestimated for a very long time finally stops explaining themselves, when walking away becomes a decision, not a reaction. Over the next hour or so, I'll take you through the emotional terrain of that choice. You'll hear about the small dismissals that seemed insignificant at the time, the moments I rationalized away because they were easier to ignore than to name, the role I was quietly assigned, and how long I played it without realizing the cost. You'll also hear about the shift, not a confrontation, but an internal recalibration. A moment when silence stopped being endurance and became intention. When I started observing instead of absorbing, listening instead of defending, preparing instead of pleading. This isn't a story about winning. It's about alignment, about recognizing when staying loyal to a structure requires betraying yourself, about understanding that leaving doesn't always mean you stop caring. It can mean you finally start being honest. I'm telling this story now because too many people believe that strength has to be loud to be real, that justice has to be theatrical to be earned, that walking away without chaos means nothing really happened. Something did happen, just not in the way they were watching for. If you've ever felt quietly essential and yet strangely replaceable, if you've ever realized too late that your silence was being mistaken for consent, or if you've ever wondered whether clarity can be more powerful than confrontation, then this story might feel familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever stayed longer than you should have? Not because you didn't know better, but because you hoped being patient would eventually be enough? To them, I was the constant, not the center of attention, not the decision maker, just the steady presence that made everything else function. If something needed to be remembered, organized, smoothed over, or quietly fixed before it became a problem, it usually landed in my hands. And I took it, not because I was asked, but because I noticed. In my family, I was known as easygoing. That word came up a lot. easy to talk to, easy to rely on, easy to overlook. People said it like a compliment, and I accepted it that way for years. I thought ease meant harmony. I thought if I didn't complicate things, I was contributing to peace. At gatherings, I was often on the edges of conversations, refilling drinks, checking on the kids, listening more than speaking. If I offered an opinion, it was usually met with polite nods before the discussion drifted back to louder voices. No one was unkind about it. That's what made it confusing. There was no obvious cruelty to push against, just a pattern of quiet omission. I became very good at being useful. If someone needed help moving, I showed up early. If plans fell apart, I rearranged my schedule. If emotions ran high, I became the calm buffer in the room. People trusted me with their stress, but rarely asked how I was holding mine. And because I didn't volunteer that information, they assumed there was nothing to ask. At home, the dynamic was similar. I was the emotional infrastructure, the one who remembered appointments, anticipated needs, absorbed moods. When decisions were made, they were often presented as conclusions rather than conversations. Not because anyone meant to exclude me, at least that's what I told myself, but because I had become predictable, agreeable, safe. I didn't protest. I adapted. There's a certain invisibility that comes with being reliable. When you consistently handle things without complaint, people stop noticing the effort it takes. They start seeing the outcome as natural, inevitable, as if it would exist with or without you. And I played into that without realizing it. I told myself I didn't need recognition, that my satisfaction came from knowing things were running smoothly, that wanting more visibility was ego, not self-respect. I was proud of being the one who didn't need applause. But here's the truth. I didn't have language for back then. Being underestimated doesn't feel like an insult. It feels like comfort until it doesn't. The way people saw me shaped the way they treated me, and the way they treated me shaped the expectations placed on me. I was the one who would adjust, the one who would understand, the one who would stay quiet if speaking up made things awkward. Not because I lacked opinions, but because I learned early that expressing them rarely changed the outcome. So I became selective with my words, efficient, measured. I spoke when it felt necessary and stayed silent when it didn't. Over time, that silence began to define me more than my thoughts ever did. If you had asked anyone then whether I was unhappy, they would have said no. And they would have believed it. I smiled easily. I showed up consistently. I didn't make waves. What they didn't see was the slow narrowing of my internal world. The way I started editing myself before speaking. The way I anticipated dismissal before it happened. The way I learned to make myself smaller, not out of fear, but out of habit. I wasn't invisible because I was ignored. I was invisible because I made it easy. And at the time, I thought that was a strength. The first time it happened, I didn't call it disrespect. I told myself it was nothing. One of those moments that only feels sharp because you're tired, or sensitive, or reading too much into things. That's what I was good at, contextualizing discomfort until it disappeared, or at least until it went quiet. We were sitting around the kitchen table. The kind of ordinary evening that barely registers as memory while it's happening. Papers spread out, schedules are being discussed. Someone was talking about a plan that would affect everyone: time, logistics, money. I remember listening carefully, waiting for a pause so I could speak. When I did, my voice was calm, thoughtful. I offered a practical concern, nothing emotional, nothing confrontational, just a detail that mattered. The response wasn't hostile, it was worse than that. Someone laughed lightly. Another person kept talking as if I hadn't spoken at all. The conversation moved on, my words dissolving into the air between sentences. No one said, "That's not important." No one needed to. I sat there, hands still wrapped around my mug, feeling something tighten and then flatten inside my chest. It was subtle, easy to ignore. And I did. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my head, trying to understand why it bothered me. It wasn't the outcome. The plan would have gone forward either way. It was the erasure, the sense that my input hadn't even earned disagreement. Disagreement at least acknowledges presence. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it, that people interrupt each other all the time, that I should have spoken louder or earlier or with more confidence. I framed it as a personal flaw, something I could correct if I tried harder. That framing felt safer than admitting what it really was: a signal. Small cuts are like that. They don't bleed enough to alarm anyone. They barely leave a mark. And because they're not dramatic, they're easy to excuse, especially when everyone else does. A week later, it happened again. Different setting, different topic, same result. I offered something considered and measured, and it slipped past the group without impact. This time, someone else repeated a similar point minutes later, and it landed. It was acknowledged, built upon. I noticed the difference immediately, and then I did what I had always done. I swallowed it. I told myself it wasn't intentional, that people hear things differently depending on who says them, that maybe I hadn't been clear enough. I stayed polite, neutral, composed. What I didn't do was speak up afterward. I didn't say, "I mentioned that earlier." I didn't ask why my voice hadn't registered. I didn't correct the narrative, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that pointing out invisibility often makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort rarely leads to accountability. So I let it go. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still reliable, still present, still helpful. Inside, though, something shifted, just a fraction. A quiet awareness began to form. Not anger, not resentment. Attention. I started noticing how often my contributions were treated as optional background noise, how my presence was assumed, but my perspective was negotiable, how my silence was interpreted as agreement rather than and patience. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they didn't think it mattered. And maybe to them, it didn't. But to me, it did, because it wasn't about being heard once. It was about the pattern that was beginning to emerge. A pattern that suggested my role was not to influence, but to support. Not to shape decisions, but to absorb their consequences. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. I stopped rushing to fill gaps in conversations. I paused longer before speaking. I watched who was listened to and who wasn't. I paid attention to how quickly my presence faded once my usefulness was no longer immediate. The first small cut didn't hurt because it was deep. It hurt because it showed me exactly where the blade had been placed. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee. After the first few moments like that, I stopped thinking of them as incidents. They became background noise, tiny distortions in the rhythm of daily life that were easier to adapt to than to challenge. That's how normalization works. Nothing escalates, nothing explodes. The behavior doesn't get worse all at once. It just gets familiar. I learned where my words would land and where they wouldn't. I learned which topics invited engagement and which ones triggered polite dismissal. Over time, I adjusted accordingly. I spoke less in certain rooms. I softened opinions before voicing them. I framed ideas as questions so they'd feel less intrusive. Maybe I'm wrong, but just a thought, feel free to ignore. It's probably not a big deal. Those phrases became armor, not because I lacked confidence, but because I had learned that confidence coming from me made others uneasy. And unease, I had been taught, was something to manage quietly. What's dangerous about subtle disrespect is that it doesn't demand a response. There's no clear line to point to, no single comment you can quote without sounding oversensitive. And because it's never overt, it's easy to internalize it as a personal failing. So I did. I asked myself why I needed validation, why I felt unsettled when my input wasn't acknowledged. I reminded myself that everyone brings value in different ways, and maybe mine just wasn't verbal. Maybe my strength was in execution, not influence. That explanation held for a while, but the moments kept stacking. Plans were made without consulting me, then adjusted at the last minute with the assumption that I'd accommodate. Decisions were announced as if they were collaborative, even when I hadn't been included. When I hesitated or asked for clarification, it was framed as resistance rather than participation. Why are you making this complicated? It's already been decided. We thought you'd be fine with it. Fine. That word followed me everywhere. I was fine with schedule changes. Fine with taking on extra responsibilities. Fine with being the emotional shock absorber when tensions rose. And because I rarely contradicted that label, it stuck. The truth was, I wasn't fine. I was quiet, and quiet people are often mistaken for flexible ones. I told myself that staying calm was maturity, that choosing my battles was wisdom, that reacting emotionally would undermine the stability I'd worked so hard to maintain. I believed that if I just stayed consistent, respectful, and reasonable, the dynamic would eventually balance itself. It didn't. Instead, the silence I thought was temporary became expected. The patience I offered became entitlement. The understanding I extended became a baseline, not a gift. And still, I didn't confront anyone. Not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I was afraid of being misunderstood. I could already hear the responses if I spoke up. Confusion, defensiveness, denial. We didn't mean it that way. You should have said something sooner. You're overthinking this. Those phrases are powerful deterrents. They shift responsibility back onto the person who noticed the problem. They imply that awareness itself is the issue. So I kept my awareness to myself, I started documenting things, not formally, not with intent, just notes in my mind, patterns, reactions, who was given space to disagree and who wasn't, who could change their mind without explanation, and who was expected to adapt without complaint. I didn't feel victimized. I felt misplaced, like I was standing slightly off center in a structure that had already decided where I belonged. There were moments I considered speaking up. I rehearsed conversations in my head, calm, reasonable explanations. But each time, I asked myself the same question: would this change anything, or would it just make things heavier? At that point, the answer was always the same. So I stayed. I adjusted. I told myself that loyalty meant endurance, and that clarity would come later. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing the disrespect, I was training everyone, including myself, on how little it took to silence me. And once that lesson is learned, it's very hard to unteach. It took me a long time to understand that roles aren't always chosen. Sometimes they're assigned quietly through repetition, expectation, and the absence of resistance. By the time I noticed mine, it was already well established. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person everyone assumed would handle whatever fell through the cracks. Not because I volunteered every time, but because I had proven, over and over, that I could be counted on to adapt. If something needed to be done last minute, I'd make it work. If emotions ran high, I'd de-escalate. If plans shifted, I'd rearrange my life around them. And gradually, that flexibility stopped being appreciated and started being relied upon. The role came with unspoken rules. I wasn't supposed to complicate things. I wasn't supposed to need much. I wasn't supposed to say no, unless there was a really good reason. My value wasn't in my perspective. It was in my availability. No one ever said this out loud. That's what made it so effective. I noticed how conversations changed when I pushed back, even gently. The room would tighten. People would exchange glances. My response would be framed as unexpected, even disruptive. Oh, okay. We didn't realize you'd feel that way. I thought you were more flexible than this. This is kind of out of character for you. Out of character. As if my character had been collectively defined without my input. The irony was that I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. I wasn't demanding control or special treatment. I was asking to be considered, to be consulted, to have my limits acknowledged. But those requests didn't fit the role. The role required quiet competence, emotional steadiness, endless accommodation. It required me to be useful without being visible, essential without being central. And because I had played it so well for so long, any deviation felt like a breach of contract, one I hadn't known I'd signed. I began to see how predictability had worked against me. People felt safe assuming my agreement because I rarely contradicted them. They felt comfortable deciding for me because I'd always found a way to make it work. In their minds, I wasn't being sidelined. I was being spared. We didn't want to burden you. We knew you'd understand. We figured you'd be okay either way. Those explanations were offered with genuine sincerity. That was the most disorienting part. No one thought they were taking advantage of me. They believed they were being considerate. But consideration without consultation is just control with better manners. I started to feel like a background system, important but unnoticed unless it failed. As long as everything ran smoothly, no one questioned how much effort it took to keep it that way, and I didn't let it fail. I kept showing up, kept managing emotions, kept smoothing edges. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, I began to feel the weight of the role pressing down on me. Not resentment, recognition. I realized that if I continued like this, I would eventually disappear inside the function I served. That my identity would be reduced to how useful I was to others, not how aligned I was with myself. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. I stopped over-explaining, stopped preemptively offering solutions. I began noticing how quickly people filled the space when I didn't, how uncomfortable they became when I didn't immediately adapt. The role had worked because I had maintained it, and the moment I loosened my grip, even slightly, the imbalance became visible. For the first time, I understood something crucial. They didn't expect me to leave. They expected me to endure. And that expectation was the clearest sign yet that the role I'd been given no longer fit the person I was becoming. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no breaking point that anyone else could point to later and say, that's when it all went wrong. If you'd been watching, you would have missed it entirely. I almost did. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends into every other one. I was alone in the house for a few hours, the quiet broken only by the low hum of appliances and the occasional sound from outside. I remember sitting at the table with my notebook open, not writing anything, just staring at the page. That stillness did something to me. Without the usual noise of expectations and reactions, my thoughts had room to surface. And what came up wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. Not physical, but emotional, the kind that comes from constantly calibrating yourself to other people's comfort. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. If nothing changes, can I live like this indefinitely? The answer came quickly, and it scared me because it was so calm. No, not I can't do this anymore. That would have implied panic. Just a quiet, settled number. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for things to improve. I was waiting for permission to stop carrying them. And that permission was never going to come. Something else became clear in that moment. I didn't want to explain myself anymore. I'd spent years translating my needs into language that wouldn't disrupt anyone, softening truths, delaying honesty until it felt acceptable. I had become fluent in other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity, and I was done negotiating with myself. That afternoon, I didn't make a plan. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I just sat there and let the realization settle. Staying was a choice I was actively making, and therefore, so was leaving. That shift changed everything. From that point on, my silence felt different. It wasn't avoidance anymore. It was an assessment. I listened with intention. I observed without intervening. I started separating what was mine to carry from what I'd been carrying out of habit. I noticed how often decisions were made without me, and how little effort anyone made to loop me in once they assumed I'd adjust. I noticed how quickly my presence was taken for granted and how rarely my absence was considered. Instead of reacting, I started recording, not just events, but my responses to them, how my body felt, where I tightened, when I disengaged. Patterns became impossible to ignore once I stopped explaining them away. I also noticed something else. The less I filled space, the more others rushed to fill it for me. They spoke over silence. They interpreted it. They projected meaning onto it. And none of those interpretations included the possibility that I was choosing it. That was the turning point, not a fight, not a declaration, but the internal understanding that I no longer needed to be seen to be certain. I began asking myself a different set of questions. Not, how do I make this work? But what would alignment look like? Not, how do I explain this? But do I owe an explanation at all? The clarity was unsettling at first. There's a strange comfort in endurance. You know what's expected of you. Clarity removes that safety net. It demands responsibility for your next move, but it also brings relief. For the first time in a long while, I felt grounded, not hopeful, not optimistic, just steady. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet. I only knew what I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't going to keep shrinking to preserve a role that erased me. I wasn't going to keep mistaking patience for virtue. And I wasn't going to wait for someone else to notice my absence before I allowed myself to matter. The shift happened quietly, but once it did, there was no going back to not seeing it. And that was enough to begin. After that day, my silence stopped being reflexive. Before, it had been a shield, something I used to avoid friction, to keep things moving, to protect the fragile balance I thought I was responsible for maintaining. Now, it has become a filter, a way of deciding what deserved my energy and what didn't. From the outside, nothing appeared different. I still showed up, still listened, still fulfilled responsibilities. But internally, the posture had changed. I was no longer absorbing everything automatically. I was choosing. When conversations unfolded without my input, I didn't rush to insert myself. When decisions were announced, rather than discussed, I didn't immediately adapt. I asked myself a simple question. Is this actually mine to fix? Often, the answer was no. That restraint was mistaken for weakness. People grew more comfortable making assumptions. They spoke more freely around me, sometimes carelessly. I became background again, but this time, I was paying attention. I noticed how quickly my quiet was interpreted as agreement, how easily my consistency was mistaken for compliance. The difference was that I was no longer correcting those assumptions, not out of spite, out of clarity. There's a strange power in letting people reveal how they operate when they think there will be no consequences, when they believe the structure will hold, regardless of how they treat it. I listened carefully, not to trap anyone, but to understand the system I was part of, who benefited from it, who maintained it, who never questioned it because it worked in their favor. I stopped preemptively solving problems. When something was overlooked, I let it stay overlooked, just long enough to see who noticed. When plans fell apart, I waited to see who took responsibility. Sometimes no one did. That silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. I also became more selective with my emotional availability. I stopped offering reassurance by default, stopped cushioning disappointment. When someone was upset, I listened, but I didn't automatically carry their feelings for them. That change unsettled people. They asked if I was okay, if something was wrong, if I were tired. I assured them I was fine, because I was. For the first time in years, I actually was. What they were sensing wasn't distress, it was an absence. The absence of automatic accommodation. The absence of emotional labor they had grown used to receiving without asking. I didn't explain the shift. Explanation invites negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating anymore. I was observing how much of my presence had been taken for granted. As weeks passed, patterns sharpened. I saw clearly who relied on my silence to maintain control, and who simply hadn't realized how much I'd been holding together. Not everyone was malicious. Most weren't. But intent didn't change impact. My silence, once a coping mechanism, had become data. And what that data showed me was this. The system only functioned because I compensated for its imbalance. The moment I stopped doing that, cracks appeared. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Because this phase wasn't about change yet. It was about understanding the terrain before moving through it. You don't make irreversible decisions without knowing exactly what they'll cost and what they'll free. I began to prepare quietly, not emotionally, but practically. I gathered information. I reviewed finances. I thought through logistics without urgency. Every step was measured, intentional. I wasn't planning an exit in anger. I was planning a transition in truth. The people around me mistook my calm for passivity. They assumed the silence meant nothing had shifted, that the role would hold. They didn't realize the silence was no longer something they could rely on. It was something I owned. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being a vulnerability. It becomes leverage. What they never noticed was how much attention I was paying. For years, I had been present in a passive way, listening to respond, adjusting to maintain flow, staying just alert enough to prevent disruption. Now, my attention sharpened. It became deliberate, analytical, quietly thorough. I began to see the structure beneath the relationships. Who spoke with authority and who echoed it? Who made decisions and who absorbed the consequences? Who relied on tradition, habit, or my silence to keep things comfortable? Most importantly, I saw how much of the system depended on me doing what I'd always done, without ever acknowledging that dependency out loud. I didn't announce my preparation. I didn't hint at it. I simply stopped wasting energy on things that had never been reciprocal. That freed up more time than I expected. Time to read, time to learn, time to think without urgency. I reviewed documents I had signed years earlier without question. I read them slowly this time, without assuming goodwill would fill in the gaps. I organized records, financial, legal, logistical, not because I planned to use them aggressively, but because I wanted to understand where I actually stood. Clarity requires information, and information had always been available. I just hadn't needed it before. I noticed how often people spoke around me instead of to me, especially when discussing plans that relied on my participation. They assumed I'd be there, that I'd adjust, that I'd carry my portion without comment. I let them keep assuming. There's a kind of invisibility that comes with being underestimated, but there's also access. People are careless around those they don't see as a threat. They reveal priorities. They expose blind spots. I wasn't collecting secrets. I was noticing truths. I saw how decisions were framed as collective when they benefited a few, how responsibility was distributed unevenly, justified by vague ideas like, that's just how it's always been. How my past flexibility had been retroactively turned into an expectation. None of this made me angry. It made me precise. I started documenting patterns, not accusations, just facts, dates, conversations, agreements that shifted without notice, promises that became assumptions. I didn't need them for confrontation. I needed them for grounding. Memory can be gaslit. Documentation can't. I also began strengthening parts of Mshalev that had nothing to do with the role I'd been assigned. I reconnected with skills I'd set aside, updated knowledge that had gone stale, built quite a competence outside the family structure. No one noticed that either. They were too accustomed to seeing me as fixed, reliable, constant, unchanging. They didn't see that I was evolving, because evolution doesn't announce itself. It just changes what it tolerates. I practiced saying less and meaning more. When asked direct questions, I answered honestly, but minimally. When asked to commit, I paused. I stopped filling the silence with reassurance. That pause unsettled people. They mistook it for indecision. It wasn't. It was calculation. Not cold, not cruel, just clear-eyed. I was mapping outcomes, testing assumptions, watching how people responded when the usual guarantees were no longer immediate. What I learned was simple and devastating. Very few people noticed me until they needed something, and even then they noticed the function, not the person. That knowledge settled into me without drama. It didn't harden me. It clarified my priorities. I wasn't interested in teaching anyone a lesson. I wasn't interested in being understood. I was interested in alignment between my values, my actions, and my future. By the time anyone sensed that something was different, the groundwork was already laid, not for escape, but for choice. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked calm, like routine, like the same dependable presence they'd always relied on. But beneath that surface, the conditions had changed. I knew what I was capable of. I knew what I was willing to carry. And I knew exactly what would happen if I stopped. That knowledge didn't make me powerful in the way people imagine power. It made me unmoved. And once you reach that point, you don't need to be seen. You just need to be ready. The reveal didn't arrive with a rush of adrenaline or a sense of triumph. It came quietly, almost clinically, during a moment that felt more administrative than emotional. I was reviewing paperwork one evening, documents I had already read once before but never studied. This time I wasn't skimming for reassurance. I was reading for truth, and the truth was clearer than I expected. What I discovered wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense. No hidden betrayal, no sudden leverage that flipped the board. It was something more understated and far more decisive. I realized how much of the structure relied on my continued participation without formally securing it. Responsibilities had been assumed, not codified. Sacrifices had been normalized, not acknowledged. My contributions, financial, emotional, logistical, were embedded everywhere, yet nowhere clearly protected. For years, I had operated on good faith, on shared understanding, on the belief that mutual reliance meant mutual consideration. What the documents showed me was something else. I was essential, but unofficial, central, but unprotected, and that meant something important. It meant that my presence had been taken for granted, not planned for. The system worked because I made it work, not because it was designed to include me as an equal decision maker. That realization didn't make me feel exploited. It made me feel awake, because once you see where you're not accounted for, you also see where you're free. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. There was no reason to. This wasn't information to be used against someone. It was information to be used for myself. A private recalibration of risk and reality. I traced the implications carefully. If I stepped back, what would actually happen? What would fall apart? And what would simply reveal that it had been resting on me all along? I thought through scenarios, not with fear, but with precision. Financially, logistically, emotionally. I didn't catastrophize. I didn't fantasize. I evaluated. What emerged was clarity. Staying meant continuing to subsidize a system that had no incentive to change. Leaving, done thoughtfully, quietly, meant reclaiming authorship over my own life without needing permission or validation. There was no celebration in that moment, no sense of victory, just a deep, steady calm. Because leverage doesn't always look like power over others. Sometimes it looks like the absence of obligation. I understood then that I didn't need to argue my worth. I didn't need to convince anyone of my limits. I didn't need to force recognition. All I needed was to act in alignment with what I now knew. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, letting the weight of the realization settle, not heavily, but firmly, like a decision that has already been made internally, even if it hasn't yet been expressed externally. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about choosing myself without theatrics, about stepping out of a role that only existed because I kept performing it. The private reveal wasn't that I had power over the situation. It was that the situation had far less power over me than I had believed. And once you see that, you don't rush. You don't announce. You don't dramatize. You move carefully, intentionally, because clarity doesn't demand speed. It demands follow through. Clarity doesn't force action immediately. That was something I had to learn. There's a myth that once you know, you must act. Quickly, decisively, dramatically. But real clarity is quieter than that. It sits with you. It asks you to be honest about what you're willing to live with. I reached the decision point long before anyone else realized it existed. Outwardly, life continued as usual. Routines held. Conversations repeated themselves. Expectations remained comfortably intact for everyone but me. Internally, though, I was weighing paths with a kind of seriousness I had never allowed myself before. There were several options. I could stay and renegotiate the role, speak up, demand inclusion, ask for change. That path required energy, emotional labor, explanation, and patience. It also required something else, a willingness to be misunderstood while things shifted. I could stay and disengage emotionally, do the minimum, protect myself by caring less, That option offered temporary relief, but it came at a cost I wasn't willing to pay. I didn't want to become smaller or colder just to survive a structure that no longer fit. Or I could leave, not impulsively, not punitively, but completely. That option was the most honest and the most irreversible. Leaving meant accepting that clarity doesn't always come with applause, that some people would rewrite the story to make sense of my absence, that I would lose proximity, familiarity, and a role I had inhabited for years. But it also meant gaining something I had been missing: coherence. I sat with that for a long time, not days, months. I watched how each option felt in my body. The first brought tension, the second brought numbness, the third brought fear, but also relief. Fear isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's just a signal that you're standing at the edge of something real. I thought about what staying would teach the people around me, that I would always adjust, that my silence could be relied upon, that my needs were negotiable. And I thought about what leaving would teach me, that my clarity mattered, even if no one validated it, that walking away was a decision, not a reaction, that self-respect doesn't require consensus. I didn't frame the decision as escape. I framed it as authorship. At a certain point, continuing to participate in a system that erases you becomes a form of self-betrayal. And I had reached the limit of what I was willing to betray. The moment I chose wasn't dramatic. I was alone, again, with my notebook open. I wrote a single sentence, not a plan, not a manifesto, just a truth I could return to when doubt crept in. I am no longer available for a life that requires me to disappear. That was it. From that point on, everything became logistics. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't test reactions. I didn't seek reassurance. I simply moved forward with the knowledge that the path behind me was closed, not out of bitterness, but out of integrity. Irreversibility isn't about burning bridges. It's about crossing a threshold you know you won't step back over. I allowed myself to grieve what I was leaving, not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. I honored the effort I had given, the love I had invested, the patience I had practiced. And then I let it go. Because clarity doesn't ask you to punish anyone. It asks you to stop punishing yourself. Once the decision was made, I felt lighter. Not because the future was certain, but because the internal conflict was resolved. There's peace in choosing a direction, even when you don't know exactly what lies ahead. The decision point wasn't the end of the story. It was the point of no return. Once the decision was made, I became very quiet in a different way. Not withdrawn, not secretive, just focused. There's a misconception that leaving requires confrontation, that clarity must be announced in order to be real. But I had already learned what announcements invite: debate, delay, distortion. I wasn't interested in any of that, so I moved in silence. I handled what needed to be handled without emotional commentary. I gathered documents. I consulted professionals discreetly. I separated finances with care, not urgency. Every step was deliberate, legal, and grounded in facts rather than feelings. Nothing about the process was rushed. That was important to me. I didn't want my exit to look like a reaction to a bad week or a single disagreement. I wanted it to reflect what it truly was: the result of sustained awareness and thoughtful choice. I kept showing up as expected. I fulfilled obligations I had already agreed to. I didn't withdraw support abruptly. Consistency, I knew, would keep suspicion low, and more importantly, it allowed me to leave without unnecessary harm. People often assume silence means nothing is happening. That assumption worked in my favor. I noticed how little attention was paid to the mechanics of daily life, as long as the outcomes remained the same. No one asked how things were getting done. They just assumed they would continue to be. I let them in the background. I built independence piece by piece, financial accounts, personal records, a support system outside the structure I was leaving. I made sure I understood my options before needing to use them. Every action was reversible until it wasn't. That's the thing about moving in silence. It gives you time to think, time to correct mistakes, time to ensure that when you do speak, you're not asking for permission. You're stating reality. There were moments when I felt the urge to explain myself early, to soften the impact, to prepare people emotionally for what was coming. But I stopped myself. Preparation is only helpful when it's welcomed. In my case, it would have been seen as confusion or hesitation, an opening for reassurance instead of respect. So I held my ground quietly. I also paid attention to how people spoke about the future. How often did they include me in plans without checking? How casually they assumed my continued availability. Those assumptions reinforced my resolve, not with bitterness, with confirmation. I wasn't breaking anything that had been built intentionally. I was stepping away from something that had been built around me without my consent. As the weeks passed, I felt a steady calm settle in. Not excitement, not fear, just alignment. My actions matched my internal truth for the first time in years. That alignment made everything easier. When the final steps came, paperwork completed, logistics arranged, contingencies set, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. The silence had done its work. By the time anyone noticed that something was different, it was already too late to undo it. Not because I was hiding, but because I had been thorough. Moving in silence isn't about deception. It's about dignity. It's about leaving in a way that doesn't require justification, defense, or validation. It's about protecting your future instead of managing other people's reactions. And when the silence finally breaks, it doesn't sound like an argument. It sounds like a statement. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in small disruptions, subtle enough to be confusing, gradual enough that no one could immediately trace them back to me. At first, it was just friction. Things took longer. Details were missed. Tasks that had always been handled quietly weren't. I noticed before anyone else did, not because I was watching for fallout, but because I recognized the absence. I had been the connective tissue for so long that I could feel where the strain would show first. Someone forgot an appointment. A plan stalled because no one followed up. A minor issue became a bigger one because it wasn't anticipated early. Nothing catastrophic, just inconvenient. At first, people shrugged it off. Bad week, poor timing, someone else would handle it. The system would correct itself, the way it always had. Except this time, it didn't, because I wasn't correcting it anymore. I stayed neutral, observant. I didn't step in to rescue, remind, or smooth over. When asked direct questions, I answered honestly, but without filling the gaps. I'm not sure. I didn't handle that. You might want to check. Those responses landed differently than I expected, not with anger, but with mild confusion, as if the floor had shifted slightly and no one could quite tell why. The first real consequence wasn't logistical, it was emotional. I saw it in the way people began scanning the room, looking for reassurance that wasn't coming. In the way conversations paused longer than usual. In the way my calm presence no longer automatically stabilized the space. Something felt off to them. They just couldn't name it. As responsibilities were redistributed unevenly, frustration began to surface. People who had never had to coordinate suddenly found themselves negotiating. People who were used to being decisive ran into resistance they hadn't anticipated. And still, no one connected it to me. Why would they? I hadn't announced a change. I hadn't protested. I hadn't withdrawn abruptly. From their perspective, I was still there. But presence without compensation changes the entire equation. I could sense the discomfort growing. Not explosive, not dramatic, just a low-level unease. A sense that something essential was missing, even if no one could articulate what. A few people began asking questions, not directly, more like probing. Have you noticed things feel harder lately? Do you think we're missing something? Did we change how we do things? I listened. I didn't answer more than was asked. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative shifted away from who had been holding things together and toward why things weren't working anymore. Systems prefer to diagnose problems structurally rather than personally. It's safer that way. But the emotional cost was real. I could see stress accumulating where ease had once existed. Tension was creeping into places that had relied on my quiet buffering, and I felt something unexpected. Not satisfied, not vindication, sadness, because I had never wanted to be indispensable. I had wanted to be included. And the fact that my absence caused strain didn't mean I had been valued. It meant I had been used efficiently. That realization confirmed everything. The consequences weren't punishment. They were exposed. Exposure of how much had rested on my unacknowledged labor. Exposure of how little redundancy existed once I stopped compensating. Exposure of a dynamic that had worked only as long as I was willing to disappear into it. I didn't step back in to restore balance, not because I wanted things to fail, but because stepping back in would have taught the wrong lesson. It would have confirmed that my role was permanent, regardless of my consent. So I stayed steady. And as the consequences continued to unfold, the question shifted from what's going wrong to what changed. They were getting closer. By the time the realization set in, it didn't come with urgency. It came with panic disguised as problem solving. Suddenly, conversations shifted tone, not confrontational, concerned. People started talking about communication issues and gaps in coordination. There were suggestions for new systems, new routines, new ways of doing things better together. What no one said out loud was the simplest explanation. I wasn't carrying it anymore. They circled the problem carefully, avoiding the center. It was easier to believe something had gone wrong than to accept that someone had stepped back intentionally. I watched the attempts to fix it with a strange mix of detachment and clarity. Meetings were called that I wasn't invited to before. My opinion was suddenly requested, tentatively, cautiously, as if it might disappear again if handled incorrectly. People asked questions they'd never asked when things were working smoothly. Do you think this could be handled differently? Would you have done this another way? Is there something we're missing? The irony was sharp, but I didn't comment on it, because by then, the window for repair had already closed. What they were offering wasn't inclusion, it was retroactive appreciation, an attempt to restore functionality without addressing the underlying imbalance. They wanted the system back, not a redefinition of roles. And I wasn't interested in returning to something that only noticed me when it malfunctioned. There was also confusion, genuine, unguarded confusion. Some people truly didn't understand how we had gotten there. They hadn't meant to exclude me. They hadn't seen the accumulation of moments that led to this point. I believed them. Intent wasn't the issue. Awareness was. A few people tried a different approach. They checked in emotionally, asked if I was overwhelmed, if I needed support, if something was going on that they should know about. Those questions came too late, not because I was resentful, but because they were framed around restoring my output, not acknowledging my autonomy. I could feel the subtle hope underneath them. If we understand what's wrong, maybe things can go back to normal. But normal had required my silence. Normal had required my disappearance. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed. I was resolved. There's a point in any long dynamic where change is no longer about fixing. It's about accepting that the structure has already shifted, that the person you thought would always be there has quietly stepped out of the role. That point had passed. I responded kindly, briefly, honestly. I didn't accuse. I didn't relitigate the past. I didn't explain the full arc of my internal journey, because by then, it wasn't a negotiation. I had already chosen. What surprised me most was how quickly urgency gave way to resignation. Once it became clear that I wasn't rushing to reinsert myself, the energy changed. Effort softened. Expectations adjusted. People began adapting, not well, not smoothly, but independently. And that was the final confirmation I needed. If I had spoken up earlier, it might have been dismissed as emotion. If I had left abruptly, it might have been framed as an overreaction. But because I left in clarity, because the change was already integrated by the time it was noticed, there was nothing left to argue with. The opportunity to fix it had existed for years. It just hadn't been taken seriously until the cost was unavoidable. By then, it was too late. Not because I wanted it to be, but because I was no longer available to be the solution. And that, I realized, was not cruelty. It was honesty. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like closure. There were no raised voices, no accusations. No list of grievances was pulled out like evidence. By the time we sat down to talk, the emotional temperature had already cooled, on my side at least. They asked if we could talk. I agreed. We sat across from each other in a familiar space, one that had hosted countless conversations over the years, most of them practical, some of them tense, very few of them honest in the way this one was about to be. The first question was careful. "Are you okay?" I answered truthfully. Yes. That answer seemed to unsettle them more than anything else I could have said. They were expecting distress, confusion, maybe even anger. What they found was calm. They asked what had changed. Why did I seem distant? Why things felt different? I didn't start from the beginning. I didn't recount every small cut or missed moment. I didn't explain how long I had been preparing. That level of detail would have turned the conversation into a defense. And I wasn't defending anything. I said something simpler. I realized I was living in a role that no longer fit me. There was a pause. Not because they didn't understand the words, but because they hadn't considered the possibility. They asked if we could fix it, if we could talk more, if things could be different. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I let them finish. And then I said the truth they weren't ready for. This isn't about fixing something. It's about acknowledging that I've already moved on, not emotionally, from responsibility. I explained that I hadn't left in anger. There was no single incident to point to. What I had done was think carefully, thoroughly, and decide. Walking away was a decision, not a reaction. That sentence landed heavily. They asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I answered gently. I did, just not in ways that made noise. I told them I wasn't blaming anyone, that I understood how the dynamic had formed, that I had participated in it too. But that understanding didn't obligate me to stay. There was silence after that, the kind that isn't empty, just full. I could see the shift happening. Not panic, not defensiveness, recognition. Too late to change the outcome, but enough to change the understanding. They asked if I was sure. I was. Not because I was inflexible, but because I knew what it had taken to arrive there. I wasn't willing to undo that clarity for the sake of comfort. I didn't demand agreement. I didn't seek validation. I didn't ask them to see things my way. I simply stated what was true for me. And then I stopped talking. There was no dramatic ending to the conversation. We stood. We acknowledged what had been said. We moved on. What struck me afterward was how light I felt. Not relieved, not victorious, just unburdened. Confrontation without heat doesn't scorch anything. It illuminates, and in that light there was nothing left to argue about. Who I am now is quieter than who I was before, but not smaller. If anything, I take up more internal space than I ever did when I was constantly accommodating others. The difference is that I no longer measure myself by how well I hold things together for everyone else. I wake up with a sense of orientation I didn't have before. Not excitement, not certainty, just alignment. My days aren't defined by anticipation of other people's needs. They're shaped by intention, choice, limits I don't apologize for. I'm still calm, still observant, still capable of carrying responsibility. Those traits didn't disappear when I left the role behind. They just stopped being exploited. What changed most was how I relate to silence. Before, silence was something I used to keep the peace. Now, it's something I use to listen to myself. I don't rush to fill gaps in conversation. I don't volunteer explanations that haven't been asked for. I let pauses exist, and I've learned that the right people don't rush to erase them. My relationships are fewer now, but clearer, mutual. When I give, it's because I choose to, not because it's expected. When I step back, it's respected. There's no bitterness in me. That surprises people when they see it. They expect distance to come with resentment. But resentment is what builds when you stay too long while betraying yourself. I left before that happened. I can acknowledge what was lost without framing it as an injustice. I can honor what I gave without demanding repayment. I can recognize the dynamic without vilifying anyone in it. That's what clarity does. It removes the need for villains. I also see myself differently now. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. I no longer believe that being needed is the same as being valued. And I no longer assume that loyalty means staying silent when something erodes me. The most profound change is internal. I trust myself. I trust the version of me that noticed something was wrong before it became unbearable. I trust the patience it took to wait, observe, and prepare. And I trust the decision I made, even on days when it's inconvenient or lonely. Because self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small, consistent ways. In what you tolerate, in what you decline, in what you no longer explain. I'm not rebuilding my life dramatically. I'm inhabiting it more honestly. And that honesty has changed how I move through the world. I'm no longer available for roles that require me to disappear. I'm no longer impressed by structures that only function when someone is quietly sacrificing themselves. I don't need to prove anything to anyone who didn't notice what it cost me to stay. Who I am now is someone who understands that leaving can be an act of care for yourself and for others, because it ends a pattern that was never going to heal through endurance alone. I didn't walk away to punish anyone. I walked away to stay intact. And that, I've learned, is not something you recover from later. It's something you choose when the moment comes. There's a reason I waited until the end to say this plainly. This story isn't about leaving a family. It's about leaving a pattern where silence is rewarded until it becomes expected, where patience is praised until it becomes invisible, where someone's reliability slowly replaces their right to be considered. Most people don't wake up one day and decide to walk away. They arrive there step by noticing what hurts, but choosing to endure. By explaining things away because it's easier than disrupting the balance. By believing that being understanding will eventually be enough. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. What I learned is that clarity doesn't arrive with permission. It doesn't come when everyone agrees. It comes when you finally stop negotiating with the part of yourself that knows the truth. I didn't leave in anger, because anger would have tied me to the outcome. It would have required someone else to be wrong for me to be right. Clarity doesn't need that contrast. Clarity stands on its own. Walking away was a decision, not a reaction. And decisions made in calm tend to last, because they're not trying to prove anything, they're trying to align something. There's a quiet dignity in choosing yourself without demanding an audience, in stepping back without tearing things down, in letting people feel the absence of what they once took for granted, not as punishment, but as a consequence. If there's a moral here, it's not leave sooner or speak louder. It's this: pay attention to what your silence is buying you and what it's costing you. Silence can be wisdom. It can be a strategy. But when it becomes self-erasure, it's no longer neutral. You don't owe endurance to systems that only work because you disappear inside them. You don't owe explanations that will only be used to negotiate you back into the same role. And you don't owe loyalty to arrangements that never made room for your clarity. Leaving doesn't make you cold. Staying doesn't make you noble. What matters is whether your life still belongs to you. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself somewhere along the way, if you've ever been the one who holds everything together while slowly coming apart, I want you to know this. You're not weak for staying. You're not selfish for leaving. You're allowed to choose the moment when enough becomes enough. So I'll leave you with one final question, one I didn't ask myself soon enough, but one that changed everything when I finally did. If nothing changes, would you still choose this life 5 years from now? If the answer is no, clarity may already be knocking. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever walked away quietly from a role, a relationship, or an expectation without anger, just understanding? Tell me in the comments.